Is John Rogers coming?
No, he's on mine.
He's on. Okay, great.
You guys ready to start? Sorry, what's after 7, so I didn't know. Okay, you might want to have your mics on, everybody. Hello, welcome to the Arpa Public Information Session of December 7th. Today we do have quite a few of our committee members. We have Misha Farrar from the Clerk Treasurer's Office. We have Troy Patton from Council. I'll get to you guys. Scott Willis from City Council. I think on the phone we have John Rogers from the administration. And myself, Cindy Spoljaric, City Council. And special guests tonight, Dustin Meeks and Mike Moga from Barnes and Thornburg, who are legal counsel for our ARPA funds. So before we get started, I did want to say if you have not signed the sign-in sheets, please do. Like to have a record of who attended tonight to be able to follow up. There's also copies of the plan in the back of the room if you're interested, as well as note cards. So this meeting is being recorded, so I do ask if you have any comments tonight and don't wish to come to the podium and speak, you can fill out a note card and hand it down at the end to Misha, and we will read it for you. So, did you guys want to start with your general presentation about ARPA, and then we can get into our local?
Yeah, we happy to take it in that order if you want to. Yep.
Fantastic, thank you.
So good evening, everybody here and then watching us from the Facebook metaverse, if you will. Good evening. My name is Dustin Meeks, and this is my associate, Mike Moga. As Cindy said, we're from Barnes and Thornburg, and we're going to start by just sort of, in brief, going over the American Rescue Plan Act and the eligible uses of the state and local fiscal recovery funds, which are funds that have been granted by the federal government down to states, territories, and local government units. I'm going to call them the ARPA funds throughout, but you might hear them called fiscal recovery funds in documents, and they're sort of interchangeable. There's a lot of ARPA funds that are not fiscal recovery funds, but we just use that as a common parlance. And I'm going to try to define all of the acronyms as I go along, but if I ever say an acronym and you're like, I don't remember what that acronym is, feel free to raise your hand, bonk me on the head and ask, which word is that? Because there's a lot of them. I'm also going to say the word buckets about 8 billion times in the course of this presentation, and so I'm sorry about that. The word will just have no meaning for you after we're done. But with those disclaimers in the way or out of the way, let's go. So go ahead and advance the slide.
Sorry, you guys are gonna have to get the keyboard down by the podium on that short ledge and drive with the presentation.
Oh, right. I forgot that.
I did too.
Can we take that up here?
No, yeah, we can. Thank you. So to start with, the American Rescue Plan Act for local governments has 4 eligible use areas in which the funds can be used, and each of them has sort of their own space and then also clear boundaries for what that particular bucket of funds can't be used for. And I'm going to go over them in brief, and then we're going to talk about most of them sort of more in depth. So the first bucket is public health and economic impacts. And those are 2 buckets, and there's several buckets under that. Like I said, I'm going to say that word a lot. The sort of clear boundary for public health and economic impacts is that there's this end part to the sentence there, which is public health and economic impacts in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So anytime that we're thinking about the first big bucket, every single thing that we might spend money on there has to be in some way responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, either its public health impacts or its negative economic impacts. The second bucket is premium pay for essential workers, and the important limits there are the concept of essential workers, and there's a couple of defined terms under there that we'll go through, because not every person who was doing work during the pandemic was doing essential work for the purposes of ARPA. and so you have to keep in mind what the box of people is there. The third bucket is replacing lost public sector revenue. We're not actually going to cover that one in depth during the presentation. Its sort of big limit is there's a very specific formula by which communities calculate whether or not they have lost revenue. Lost revenue funds can be helpful because they can be spent on any government service, which is similar for our purposes to can be spent on any legal purpose. But the city of Westfield does not have lost revenue under that formula. So that's just not a category that's going to be applicable here, but it is one of the 4 buckets in ARPA. And the last bucket is going to be investments in infrastructure. And if you sort of are keeping an eye on Washington, we've talked a lot this year about what is infrastructure, and a lot of things have been called infrastructure. Here it's very clear there are 3 things that are included in what we call small I infrastructure, which is water, sewer, and broadband internet. And we'll go through sort of more clearly what projects qualify as water and sewer and broadband as we go along. So our first big bucket, public health and economic impacts, like I said, responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're always reflecting on identifying a negative impact of the COVID-19 health emergency, and then identifying how the program, service, or expenditure that the city would like to make is responding to those impacts as we go along. And the nice thing about this category is that it provides us the ability to provide funds and assistance from the individual level all the way up to the organizational level and to the government itself in both the public health bucket and the negative economic impacts bucket. So, like I said, the buckets are sort of the easiest way to think of this. So we have the big bucket, which is public health and negative economic impacts. And then under that, I like to think that there's 2 buckets, public health and negative economic impacts. In the public health bucket, there are 4 sub-buckets. So we're up to, that's what, 6 or 7 buckets thus far. Responding to the public health pandemic really comprises 4 things. COVID mitigation and containment, which is going to be things in this left column here on the slide. So vaccination programs, testing, contact tracing, purchasing of PPE, doing public health tracking, and enforcement of your public health orders. Second is going to be medical expenses. These are things like putting money into research to ensure that we're accurately taking care of variant risk, expenses of long-term care for folks who have long COVID, and other public health needs that are sort of directly related to medical care. Third is going to be behavioral health, and I'm going to discuss that on another slide. And fourth is going to be public health and safety staffing. So insofar as any unit in a local government is sort of directly targeted at responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, one eligible use of the ARPA funds in the public health sphere would be to provide for pay and benefits for your public health staffing needs. One thing I want to point out, in the right column, and this has been very popular in a lot of communities in terms of using the ARPA funds, insofar as you have congregate facilities in your community or public facilities where the public is regularly interacting with the government, you can use ARPA funds to make physical updates to the facility to replace HVAC systems that are not adequately filtering the air as a virus mitigation step, or to expand office spaces to provide for greater ability for social distancing or to put up barriers. The caveat there is that unfortunately the IFR does not embrace new construction, so it has to be an existing facility, but you can make some capital investments as long as they're responding to the burdens that the virus is putting on our public facilities. So circling back to the behavioral health component, it is permissible to use the ARPA funds to provide programs for mental health treatment, substance abuse, crisis intervention, and other behavioral health care services in the community. This is in response to the fact that sort of the long isolation that COVID has caused, and also sort of the added stress of constantly thinking about this very scary concept of the global pandemic. There's we have seen nationwide increases in violence and also increases in mental health issues. And so ARPA sort of recognized that by offering this as an option. And as I mentioned, the sort of fourth piece is the providing for the costs of public health care staffing, insofar as they have been increased, or you have units that are dedicated to dealing with the public health crisis. So that kind of covers the public health sub-bucket. Now I'm going to talk about the negative economic impact sub-bucket, and this is in some ways the most broad bucket or of all of the buckets in ARPA. It also has 4 components, so I think that's kind of easy to remember. There's 4 public health things, and there's 4 economic impact things. And our 4 economic impact things are going to, sort of the easiest way to think of them is individuals, so workers and families, organizations, small businesses, and nonprofit organizations in the community, sectors, specifically here, hospitality, travel, and tourism are what's called out by the IFR. That's sort of a little bit more complex. And then the government as an entity. So sort of talking about each of those individually. So for workers and families, ARPA funds can be used for things like direct payments to households, similar to the economic impact payments that you received from the federal government, rent and mortgage assistance, and funds for legal aid for persons who need rental and mortgage assistance, to avoid eviction, assistance to unemployed persons, job training, child care assistance, transportation to and from work, or to and from job interviews if that's a need, and incentives to seek employment, as well as survival benefits and burial costs for families of COVID-19 victims. I'm gonna get real in depth on small businesses and nonprofits, because that seems to be a big priority here in Westfield. And actually, I'm just going to leave that. There's like the next 3 slides are all about that. We're going to have a nonprofit bonanza. So put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to it. Tourism, travel, and hospitality. You have sort of broad latitude under the ARPA funds to provide support to businesses that are in that sector, or businesses that are in similarly impacted sectors. So the IFR points out, the IFR, by the way, is the interim final rule. I said I was going to define the acronyms, and I forgot to. So there you go. There's the definition. In hospitality, tourism, and travel, they saw losses of revenue of upwards of 24% and losses in employment of upwards of 17%. So sort of similarly impacted industries that were doing just fine and then saw an almost quarter drop off in revenue and employment are going to be similarly situated. So it's going to be a discrete class of industries, but there's wide latitude to assist those industries. And then, insofar as any of your government units had staffing on January 27th, 2020, that was greater than what they have now, you have the ability to use ARPA funds to rehire public sector staff up to your pre-pandemic levels and to pay the full costs of wages and benefits and ancillary costs related to that, to restore the capacity of government to provide services. So like I said, here's your bonanza on nonprofit entities. I think the most important thing to start with, there are voluminous compliance guidelines that go along with the ARPA funds. And the bulk of those compliance guidelines relate to what are called transfers. And so under ARPA, anything that the government can do, right, so any of those 4 buckets, the government also has the ability to transfer money down to a nonprofit entity or a special purpose unit of local government to do those same things, but on the government's behalf. What comes with that is an extensive vetting process for deciding what kind of groups are going to get transferred to them, very clear agreements about what the funds can be used for and the way that those funds are going to be tracked, and then a compliance process afterwards in line with ensuring that the funds are expended appropriately for the eligible uses for which they were granted down to the unit. And I think the best way the sort of like most clear-cut example of this is, say, for example, you had a city and you have a major, rent and you have sort of a rent crisis, right? And the biggest problem that you are facing as a result of the pandemic is people are facing eviction. and you have an organization in your community that does really great work connecting people to resources that help them avoid being evicted by meeting their rent obligations, working with landlords to defer those things, or seeking legal services, right? The government could reinvent the wheel and try to provide those services. Or they could transfer the money down to this nonprofit entity that is already providing those services and have that entity provide those services, right? What's critical is those services are eligible. The government could have done that on their own. And if they're going to do that, they have to develop a sort of close relationship with that organization in monitoring the way that the funds are used and ensuring that those funds are used in the exact same way by a nonprofit entity that they would have been used by the government. Transfers are complicated. And as we're going to talk about the Westfield plan, so later on when we're talking about the Westfield plan, what is contemplated is not really transfers. What is contemplated by the Westfield plan, by and large, is grants. So also under ARPA, and this is actually specifically in the responding to the COVID-19 public health and negative economic impacts sort of portion bucket, specific to that bucket. The transfers could be for any of the buckets. Grants just for that bucket number one that we went over. You can make grants down to nonprofit entities or small businesses to help them respond to the public health and negative economic impacts of COVID-19. And grant funding is going to come with like a grant agreement that is like clear about you have told us that there is a public health or economic impact need for this money. We're providing you this money to meet that need, and you promise to use that money to meet your need, right? And sort of much less rigorous long-term oversight. And also some wider ability to use the money for expenses that were incurred prior to March 3rd of 2021. There's still going to be oversight, right? Like, sort of, we don't just throw federal money around. I actually saw a news story this week about a guy. We joked when like the CARES Act came out and like that like nobody was gonna be stupid enough to like go buy a Ferrari with their PPP money, and somebody is now in federal prison or is going to be in federal prison probably for buying a Ferrari with their PPP money, right? So like no federal money comes to you without some oversight, but the grants have sort of much lower oversight, specifically because they're responding to negative economic impacts, and they're not asking the recipient to step into the place of the government and provide a service, right? But I think it's important to lay that out before we get into talking about grants to nonprofit entities. So what is important to understand about, and the IFR, God love it, is sometimes unclear, and this is one point on which it is clear. It's very clear. It says assistance or aid to individuals or businesses that did not experience a negative economic impact from the public health emergency would not be an eligible use under the responding to the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic emergency, which is great that they're being clear. It'd be nice if they would be clear on things that weren't clear from like the concept of responding to the negative economic impact of COVID-19, but they have told us that. So what they also tell us is that the eligible use responding to the pandemic and its negative economic impacts has to respond. So we have to identify for grant recipients what the negative economic impact was, and we have to provide a response that was related and reasonably proportional to the extent and type of economic harm that was experienced, or public health risk that there is if we don't respond. And helpfully, in sub-regulatory guidance, there's laid out that this sort of longer list, assistance may be targeted to businesses facing financial insecurity with substantial declines in gross receipts or facing other economic harm due to the pandemic, as well as businesses with less capacity to access credit, small businesses, and businesses who are serving disadvantaged communities. So there's a lot of different ways that we can show negative economic impacts. And also important to understand about the IFR is that governmental units have an ability to identify classes and groups that suffered negative economic impacts, and then they don't, if you fit into the class and group, right, we can presume you suffered negative economic impacts. And I think the best way, what the example the IFR uses, and I think that this is helpful, is if you had a city, right, and you said persons who are low and moderate income, and according to housing and urban development, low and moderate income for our, city or county is this, who have been unemployed in the last 2 years, right? Those people suffered negative economic impacts. And then, everybody who meets those two criteria, right? Income below, a certain threshold suffered unemployment in the last 2 years. We don't have to inquire further, right? Like if you meet those two criteria, we have determined that is a negative, you've suffered a negative economic impact. And so, so you can almost do it by classes. And the same thing for business organizations, right? So, your criteria have to be reasonable, but you do have an ability to identify a class or group based on certain criteria that are reasonable, and then proceed with these groups suffered negative economic impacts. But we do have to have some kind of negative economic impact or a public health need that we are responding to for entities that we're providing grants. These are the kind of 4 things that are called out in the IFR and sub-regulatory guidance as appropriate uses for grants to small businesses and nonprofit entities. So loans or grants to mitigate financial hardship due to declining in revenue, business closure, all of those which can be used to support payroll benefits, retaining employees, keeping the facility lit, and with running water, and then other operating costs for the business. The second category there is going to be responding to the public health needs of a business or nonprofit entity. So insofar as you need help with setting up your space to permit social distancing in the operation of your business, or you need help in acquiring the materials to do enhanced cleaning of your facility, or partitions, or if you're an organization that is set up to provide vaccination testing or contact tracing, right? Like all of those are going to be eligible grant uses. This one is actually kind of a fun one. You can make grants to support and enhance outdoor spaces insofar as they would either respond to the COVID-19 pandemic or a negative economic impact, right? So the sub-regulatory guidance points out that like if there's a lack of outdoor dining, right, or like a space could be outfitted for outdoor dining, and that would help a small business to stay open because indoor dining would not be COVID safe. You can help them set up their space for outdoor dining, and you also could provide money to do facade improvements in neighborhoods where the built environment has declined as a result of the negative impacts of COVID-19. And then lastly, you can provide for the cost of technical assistance, counseling, and other services to assist businesses that have suffered negative economic harm to make kind of smart business decisions that will help them get through what has been a hard 2 years and into the future. And so ends my brief shindig on grants. And I'm now going to turn it over to Mike so that you don't have to listen to my voice for a brief period. I'm coming back. You can't escape me, but.
Well, before we go to the next bucket, does anyone have any questions on that first section that Dustin just talked about? Or we can always save the questions for the end, whichever you guys prefer.
Did you do, Cindy and I, did you do cards? Is that how you wanted to do it?
Well, there are cards available in the back if you don't wish to come to the podium and ask a question. So if you do have a question and don't want to come to the podium, just fill out a card and hand it to Misha at the end there, and she will pass it down for us to read. Again, only if you're not comfortable with the podium. Otherwise, just come up to the podium and hit the middle button there to turn the mic on.
Yes. Yeah, our folks online can't hear you if you're not talking into a microphone is the challenge there.
So why don't I go ahead and get going on premium pay, and then we can open up for questions again after premium pay. So premium pay, the next bucket, as Dustin likes to reference them as, is essentially a compensation to respond to the increased risk that eligible workers experience while doing essential work. And I put emphasis on eligible workers or eligible employees, in essential work, because that's the first step on identifying who's going to get this premium pay. But I want to take a step back here and respond to means that, to the increased risk means that some employees will be going out there and interacting with other people and will have an increased risk of contracting COVID-19 from other people. This premium pay is meant to compensate for that increased risk. So like I mentioned earlier, the first thing to do is identify eligible workers in essential work when we deal with premium pay. So as you can see here, eligible workers are those who regularly interact in person and handle things that are handled by others, handle items such as paper or other items that can you can contract COVID-19 from. Essential work is work involving regular in-person interactions or regular physical handling of items that are also handled by others. So examples of eligible workers doing essential work would be your frontline workers, those in the fire departments, police officers, nurses, those working in grocery stores, factories. Actually, I believe it's the third slide. We'll actually go through a list of eligible employees as well. Yeah, go ahead and go to the next one. Yeah. So once we identify who can receive the premium pay, we look into how we give them the premium pay. So the first thing to remember is it can be up to $13 per hour in additional wages. This premium pay is an additional compensation on top of their original payment, because again, it's meant to compensate for that additional risk that they're receiving from doing the work during COVID-19 times. The amount may not exceed $25,000 for any eligible single eligible worker. You should prioritize those who are undercompensated for their work. However, any eligible employee can receive this premium pay, but additional justifications may be required for certain employees. You can provide this retroactively. It goes from January 27th, 2020, all the way to the last day that funds may be incurred under ARPA, which is December 31st, 2024. And this premium pay can also be provided to third-party employers to give to their eligible employees doing essential work, should they have any. However, it should be noted that these transfers need to be well documented. You need to document why your employee is an eligible employee and why the work they're performing is essential work. It also needs to be kept in mind that the subrecipient, the Westfield business that would be receiving this funds, would need to follow the same guidelines under ARPA that the city of Westfield would have to. You go to the next one. And there's the list I mentioned earlier of examples of eligible employees. And then I'll use this opportunity to also mention the plan that I believe, Cindy, did you hand out this plan? Or it's in the back, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the plan that I believe it's in the back here, if you look towards the third to last page, I believe it is, it's section 3B, it goes over Westfield's plan for premium pay as we have it now. So for the first tranche of ARPA payments, 5% will be going towards premium pay. That you can break that 5% out into two buckets. $1,500 has been approved for certain frontline staff in the fire and police departments. Within that 5%, the additional funds can be used for premium pay to other eligible employees who performed essential work as identified at a later time. And this is going to be for work performed from January 27, 2021 to present day.
So the sort of the bottom line to remember with premium pay is that we had to have an individual who was doing work in an essential critical infrastructure role, which includes government employees, and that individual had to be on site on the job and interacting with folks. So folks who were teleworking are not considered eligible, and folks who were not in sort of critical infrastructures are not going to be in that eligible pool. But insofar as a person was eligible and performing essential work, there is latitude to provide premium pay that responds to the work that they were doing as a result of the pandemic. Thank you, Mike. So talking about infrastructure. So you are allowed, like I said earlier, to make investments in 3 infrastructure categories: water, sewer, and broadband. Kind of helpfully, partially because the interim final rule is sometimes very unclear, the federal government made the helpful decision where water and sewer were concerned, to simply borrow the eligibility criteria from an existing, long-standing, well-fleshed-out, well-explained set of federal programs operated by the Environmental Protection Agency. Those programs are the CWSRF, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and the DWSRF, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And so those two programs are programs that the federal government uses to provide loans to local government units to enhance water treatment, water access, and water quality. And the eligibility criteria under those two programs are also going to be the eligibility criteria for what projects in water and in sewer and in stormwater are going to qualify as appropriate uses of ARPA funds. So under the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, there are 6 categories of eligibility, and under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, there are 11 categories of eligibility. And every time that one of the many communities that we advise about ARPA comes to me with a project, I have to become a very quick environmental science student. I do a lot of Googling in the CWSRF. To try to fit it in. But the nice thing is I have like 17 clear categories. A lot of ARPA sometimes is very, very careful reading and rereading to try to determine what does the IFR mean. And here the EPA is a little bit more clear, if sciencey. So there's kind of a sciencey component to this. And then broadband access. And I'm going to touch very briefly on broadband. And why broadband is a fine use for your ARPA funds, and the ways that ARPA can be used for broadband, but also that there are a lot of other funds available that could potentially be better used for broadband projects in lieu of using your ARPA funds for those. What is not sort of the caveat to infrastructure here, right? So I mentioned what infrastructure is. For these purposes, what infrastructure is not are general economic development projects or any of your, what comes to mind sometimes when you think of infrastructure is like roads. So road projects are not included under ARPA, though we're gonna talk about an asterisk on that concept. And then things like like community development block grant kind of infrastructure projects are probably also not gonna be ARPA projects. So we're cabined. I'm going to talk more about you're going to get as tired of these two acronyms as you are the word buckets, the CWSRF and the DWSRF. So included under those two are things like stormwater runoff, water pollution, flood control, and green infrastructure. The fun thing about this is, so like that last bullet point, right? Green infrastructure that supports stormwater resiliency, including rain gardens and green streets. I did not know what a rain garden is. I now know what a rain garden is. I'm facilitating the creation of a rain garden, which is more than I ever thought my legal career would amount to. So you can do rain gardens. And you would think that would be niche enough that they wouldn't mention it specifically in the IFR, but they do. Very specifically, you can do rain gardens. So more examples. So under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, you can construct, improve, and repair wastewater treatment plants. You can control non-point sources of pollution, which are going to be things like your stormwater runoff. Stormwater projects kind of fall into that category. Improving the resilience of your infrastructure to severe weather events. There are limits to that category. Sounds very big, and it's less big than it sounds. Green infrastructure and protecting water bodies in your community from pollution infiltration. And then the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund is to assist communities in making infrastructure capital improvements, particularly in installing treatment and distribution, extending distribution, and replacing distribution systems that are inadequate or no longer safe, as well as assisting with like system security, making sure that health and environmental safety requirements are being met, and addressing risks to human health related to impure drinking water issues.
So Dustin, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
All the different buckets, quote your word, make sense when you think of the impacts and what they're trying to get from ARPA. How does water and sewer tie in to ARPA?
So,
Broadband makes a lot of sense. Water and sewer
yes.
does not.
So water and sewer. So the answer to your question is they don't.
Okay, thank you.
But this particular bucket ends up in this piece of legislation, I think, to recognize that nationwide, and this is a fairly acute problem in Indiana, but it's a problem almost everywhere, that water infrastructure generally has not been adequately maintained. And you hear, we all saw the news stories, the horror stories, right, that come out of like Flint, Michigan, and communities where the water infrastructure has been so poorly maintained, and there's been, where you end up with inhuman tragedy, right? And I think a lot of the American water infrastructure is maybe, teetering on the edge of tragedy. And I think the federal government had a serious interest, and really, I mean, ultimately, it is a public health issue. It's not a COVID issue, but it's like water quality and water pollution can be major public health issues. And so I think that's how this makes it in here, is that there's a monumental need in a lot of communities for water and sewer infrastructure development, and also there are major health impacts from water system issues, right? And to a certain extent, right? If you can help people to more safely access clean drinking water, you avoid people in the hospital for the issues related to impure drinking water and water pollution, and that might help take some of the burden off of our otherwise strained public health systems as they respond to the challenge of the virus. But the flat answer, that's a very politician.
long politically correct answer, say zero.
Not much to do with it, no. But it is in there. You can do it, and a lot of communities are interested in using the funds in this way. And I think that might also be part of it. Is sort of a recognition of well, if you can't find any of these other buckets that you like everybody has pipes. You can do pipes. Everybody has pipes. So one piece, yeah, right. Mike again, ladies and gentlemen.
So that ends the buckets that we had to go through. I did want to add one more thing about premium pay that I forgot to mention, or at least I believe I forgot to mention. The premium pay that would go to the eligible employees would be treated just like regular income, so it would be taxable. So they would need to keep that in mind when tax season comes up. But this next bill, it's not currently in law. It just passed the Senate. Is essentially ARPA 2.0. In terms of it's going to broaden ARPA. So really the main thing that Westfield needs to know is that this bill would allow local governments to allocate up to $10 million in ARPA recovery to revenue loss without having to calculate revenue loss. So I believe, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong, Westfield had $8 million in ARPA funds. All of that could be used towards revenue loss, which revenue loss, as we know, is a much more broader bucket. So there's a lot more eligible uses that could come through that. In terms of where it is now, it just passed the Senate unanimously. However, it's in the House. Last I think I checked, it was about 200 people maybe signed off on it, so they're almost there. But that doesn't mean that it's going to pass anytime soon. We never know. This is the Feds, Congress. We never know exactly how long it's going to take them to pass something because of other things that come up. But we just want to make sure we keep that in mind for the future, because this would greatly expand the eligible uses of ARPA. Did you want to add anything on that, Dustin?
Yeah, we have a lot of communities that have priorities that are not sort of within the one of the buckets. And there's a lot of I mean, as we talked about, the presentation's been going on for a hot minute now. You're well tired of me, but there's a lot of things that are in the buckets to talk about. But if the priorities that you have are not in the buckets, this bill could potentially widely open up, essentially allow you to use the funds for any legal purpose, which would allow a lot of communities to pursue priorities that are sort of deeply pressing and helpful in responding to the pandemic, but not necessarily captured by ARPA as it stands now. The two sort of like less shiny and exciting pieces of the bill, it would open up to $10 million or 30% of a government's allocation, whichever is higher, for surface transportation infrastructure. So roads would become in the ambit, as well as community development block grant projects, which can be neighborhood revitalization and kind of economic development oriented projects to a certain extent. And then also it would allow ARPA recovery funds to respond to natural disasters and their economic impacts, which is really more for the coasts than us. We don't get a lot of hurricanes in Indiana, which is the benefit. It gets to 9 degrees here, but we don't get hurricanes, so you trade-offs. So there would be wider flexibility in the use of funds. There's not new money in this bill, so you wouldn't get any additional money, but it would allow you to use your money for different things. Lastly, and this is sort of like I have to be a real technical lawyer, at least at one point during the presentation, or else you might start to like me, and we can't have that. The very sort of technical piece of here is that, so all of the money has to be incurred by December 31st, 2024, which means it has to be sort of obligated to a purpose. You have to have contracted for something. We have to know the money is going to be spent by December 31st, 2024, or else the federal government will take it back. And it has to be spent by December 31st, 2026, or the federal government will take it back. And then, importantly, government units do not have the ability to spend money on any obligation that they incurred prior to March of this year. So everything that you're going to spend the money on is going to be proactive, going forward kind of spending, and insofar as it is retroactive, with some exceptions, and we can, as the committee is working on the plan, you get into the nitty-gritty of them. Almost everything has to be money that was spent after March of 2021, and if it was spent before March of 2021, you can't reimburse it. But that's going to be our time horizon, is March 2021 through December 2026, with a hard obligation deadline in December of 2024. All of that to say two things. We have a lot of time on our hands, and so in communities all across the country, there are big needs, and these monies are going to allow people to meet big needs. But also, if you need time, if the community needs time to figure out the priorities, there is time. And to do big infrastructure projects, there's time. The converse of that is if you're going to do big infrastructure projects, there is a time horizon in which we have to do things. But luckily, for most communities, that 2024 deadline means we have time to sit and seriously consider what do we want, what's the best use of the funds to meet our community's needs in this challenging time. And that is the end of our regularly scheduled programming. And now we can talk about the Westfield specific plan, however you would like to take that.
Well, just a few things that are probably in summary and kind of simple. We received the 4.9 million. And so in that bucket that is business and nonprofit, it's looking about 2.2 million right now available. And the other big chunk there was for public works, for that stormwater kind of work. And so that is close to $2 million in there. And again, that is just for this first tranche. We have our second tranche that will be another 4.9 million next year that we will receive. So it's not like this is the end. We will get the second disbursement.
Yes.
I'm hoping. When it's not in my bank account here at this city, I worry until I see it actually in there. But
It should be next summer. So that should be before the election. So the government shouldn't change anything before, hopefully. Right, we're not expecting any upsets. So.
And the buckets that we've established, we can adjust those. It's a guideline for us to follow.
we
but
wanted to
can
have
certainly-
something available
yeah.
to bring to the public so we could get feedback and see if that's what this community really wants. Obviously, the public input part of this is critical because we need to know how the community wants this money spent. But we need to start somewhere, and so that we did. And that's why I'm hoping I hear from you all tonight on your thoughts about it, if we're heading the right direction, if you have more specific things to consider, if you have questions for our legal team or for our committee members, any of those things. Yay.
Just push the little
Push
green,
the
little
button.
button on the speaker, until it turns green.
There we go. Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. That was really insightful. So I just had a quick question. I need some clarification between the nonprofit and the small business portion of things. So if a small business provides some of the services that a nonprofit would, so for example, career counseling or job training, would nonprofits get preference over small businesses in terms of being able to apply for grants or loans in order to address those needs? Obviously, with everything going on with people losing jobs, that's huge right now.
So transfers are, so when we're asking an entity to step into the shoes of the government and provide a service that would be an eligible use of ARPA funds, that is going to be limited to nonprofit entities and like special purpose units of subunits of government. So like you could technically transfer money down to like your library district, right, or your public transit district, but not for that purpose. But there is not provision in the interim final rule, as far as I know, for transfers to a for-profit entity. So insofar as a for-profit entity is going to receive funds, it would be in the form of a grant, which would not be asking them to provide services. But if you had a business that was providing, career counseling services or providing, legal services to persons facing eviction, and the challenges of the pandemic have resulted in negative economic impacts, you could get a grant to provide for operational costs for that business. If what you need is assistance in outfitting your space to be able to meet client needs in a way that's safer, related to the virus, you could get a grant to do those things. What a for-profit entity can't do is get money transferred down to them to provide their services, is going to be the sort of cabin on that.
And does a nonprofit need to actually have the 501c3 designation?
It should be an IR at a 501. It doesn't have to be a C3. It could be a C4 or a C7, or it just has to be a nonprofit entity.
Okay.
But they have to file a 501 paperwork, right? These can't be a,
I believe so. I'd have to look at the interim final rule and see if they say the magic word, if they just call it nonprofits, or if
yeah.
they.
There's a lot of businesses out there say they're non-for-profit, but they may necessarily file the proper paperwork for that.
They might be an Indiana nonprofit corporation.
Yeah.
I would say, I'm gonna jump in here real quick, to add on to that, and to your question, and to maybe anybody else's question that may come up, it doesn't mean that just because the act says that we can do something, doesn't mean that we are going to do that. Just so everybody knows, because I don't want to give somebody false hopes that even though it says, hey, we can do this, it doesn't mean we are. So for instance, even when we talk about not-for-profits, and Scott mentioned the 501c3. So for instance, if you haven't been a not-for-profit, or you at some point were not a not-for-profit, then maybe that may disqualify you. Or, and again, it doesn't mean that just because you qualify for everything, once we look at the financial statements, if there wasn't a need, they may not qualify either. I mean, right? So, I mean, just to try to be fair, and whether it's a for-profit business, and I think one of the things that we've been said early on in our meetings wasn't with for-profit business, because I'm just going to say it, is we said, if those companies already received PPP money, or if they already received other monies, typically we are not, those would be probably last on our list.
Yeah,
If
I
there
agree.
was any money. And just to be honest with you, there's probably not going to be any more money, because we have enough water, sewer projects and all kind of, but it doesn't mean there won't be. I don't want to give somebody false hopes that, hey, there's money out there for it. So, anyways.
No, I concur with what you said, Troy. We did have some discussion around a grant program for for-profit businesses that showed a loss, and I didn't detect any support from this council in
Right.
doing something like that. There were programs out there by the federal government, that impacted those companies, and I think we were looking for ways to impact other organizations that the federal government hasn't already provided programs.
Yeah.
These are one-time funds, and that's the other thing. It talks a lot in the guidance about how these are really supposed to be transformational, I mean, if they can be in the community. And so, in targeting people who have actually had the negative impacts, and especially the, disadvantaged, lower income. And so we would like to see those used in the priority sense in that regard. I will say, we don't have the application yet. We're working on that with our legal folks to have the template that this committee will use then to work at evaluating that kind of thing. And I'm guessing there's probably going to need to be another session of some sort in the application to make sure that, that stakeholders know how to fill that out, and so we're all on the same page. But again, we don't have that yet. And we're kind of trying to take this slow and do it right. There's been numerous communities that kind of rushed in and are making some decisions and also getting slapped for it. And so we want to make sure we don't fall into that category.
I'm just, let me mention one other thing, and then Steve wants to talk, I know. So, and this is really for us and for John listening. One of the things, when we talk about public safety, and just to make sure we're all on the same page here, when we talked about, funding folks in public safety, potentially, one thing we need to remember, because I went through the calculations and even just thinking about this, is the payroll tax liability piece of that is actually going to be an additional amount, and that may eat up the rest of that pool that we were discussing before. I just want to throw that out there, because as I was listening to one of these gentlemen talk about something, I started to think of payroll costs, and I'm like, hey, actually that's, 7.65 or whatever it is, comes as an additional cost of those monies. So if you're giving away $100,000, it's going to cost you $107,000 approximately dollars.
Also mentioned this additional talking about bonus money.
Misha, hit your thing there.
But it's
No, your button. Hit your button. Right.
Sorry. We was talking about payroll. There was for example, $1,500. Some of the safety officers already meet the PERP involved, and those things, additional benefits involved. There is really hitting a line, so there was you have to consider that too. So there are benefits. There was some of the safety officers, the fire department, they have involved with the benefits, PERP and the additional.
Yeah.
So we need those need to discuss about it too.
Misha, where are we at with those, by the way? Have we started to put names to titles and start to put a
Yes,
list? Do you need anything from us on that, or?
You gave us the list. There was just title. As I went through with a payroll person with a bag, and we tried to figure it out. Some of those title people already gone or terminated, or new people jump in. They never worked at this city during the COVID time. So is that eligible for those people? So we kind of really complicated, right, situation, because they only give a title name, nobody. Which one is, we're not sure which one is eligible, because eligible person already gone. And
I think that's the new list, though. I'm talking about the firefighters and police officers. I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
think that applied to them. did it?
Firefighters, so I talked to payroll person, that's what we come out.
Okay.
So it says, you would say $1,500. Some of them involve the PERF, some of them is, so it's, that's the complicated, how many people involved the purpose, we need a further discussion about that.
Okay.
So it was include the $1,500, or after all those benefits include the $1,500. Or if you want just $1,500, there will be additional, have to come out.
Right.
$1,500 plus, and then it will be kind of more complication.
It's gonna just keep.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have to discuss that further at the
Yeah.
committee meeting next
Right.
week.
Yes, so that's,
I agree.
Come on, Steve. Come on.
Good evening. Steve Latour with the Westfield Chamber of Commerce. So I just have a bunch of different questions. Cindy said to come with a lot of questions. So some may be like, great, and others may be not so great, but I tried to follow along as you were talking during the presentation to capture everything. Just one point of clarification first and foremost. If I understand correctly, none of the requests or grants or any of those things would be retroactive prior to March of 2021. Is that correct?
So if you are giving a grant to somebody to respond to negative economic impacts, they are allowed to use the money for a negative economic impact to them prior to March 3rd of 2021.
Okay,
The government cannot spend its money on anything, any obligation it incurred prior to March
Gotcha.
3rd, 2021, but a recipient is not going to be bound by that. A transferee would. So if you transfer money down to an entity, they're bound by all the rules the government is bound by. If you're granting money, then the beneficiary doesn't. So if you're, like, say you run a pizza shop and your rent is back, is backdated, through February, you can pay that February 2021 rent. That's okay.
gotcha. So kind of along the lines of that question then, if you have a business that, let's say, lost $20,000 in 2020 and maybe lost $20,000 in 2021, and they are approved for funding, are they able to just replenish their bank account for the loss that they've shown, or does it have to be applied to a new expense or a new program? So does that question make sense?
Yes. The way that the interim final rule phrases the way that grantees should use the money is all related to specific expenditures. So I would think,
You couldn't just say, here's a loss, and I'm
Yeah.
just now replacing this loss. I've got to show that I'm going to use it
For
towards something in the
operating
future.
expenses, payroll, rent, utilities, right?
Yeah, there's one, a couple slides that had a lot of that information on that, right?
Yeah, and what I guess what I'm saying is, I think sometimes all we have is their example language, and it doesn't say you can't use it for things that aren't the example language. But from all the example language, I would assume the Treasury would take a dim view of, we put it in the bank account.
Right, yeah.
What they're looking for is, we spent it on things that were like
Thank you,
this.
yeah. Well, and I've been asking since I've learned of this, around town, what are the questions that I'm hearing? That was a question that came up about a bunch. Another was with the application itself, would there be documentation on how to document the expenses at that time so that they would understand sort of what they're getting themselves into from is this going to create an extra 10 hours of work for someone a week to now write a page worth of documentation and copy all the receipts, or that sort of thing, so that they don't find out about maybe that process later. So has any thought been given to what documentation will be needed to submit once the funds have been given? And
I can answer under the law, and I think they're going to have to answer in practice.
Sure.
Under ARPA, the sort of compliance burden for beneficiaries of grants is not burdensomely high. The objective is that
It's more on us, correct?
it's more on them to check back with you,
Sure.
that you responded to your negative economic impact, and the way that a lot of communities are doing it. And Mike actually had the very fun task of reading 1,000 different communities' grant agreements so that we could understand how a bunch of different communities were doing their grant agreements. The way that this sort of works in practice is that recipients will agree to particular reporting requirements. And so the objective is that you go in knowing this is the information we're going to need from you, and this is when. And it would be, generally, it's our objective to try to not ask for, because we understand the burden, to not ask for any information that isn't going to go pretty much directly into the report that the city has to make quarterly.
One of the
on their
crazy
use of
things, Steve,
funds.
is they're auditing us, so we have to set aside monies from the ARPA funds for our audit, and it's actually fairly steep.
yeah, I saw that in the proposal, and I thought,
10
well, that's just crazy.
Yeah, no, I know, it is crazy.
It's required right now. You
Yeah.
don't really have
The
an
State
option.
Board of Accounts said 10%.
10%.
Wow.
Good time to be an accountant.
I mean, yeah, I'm gonna start a ARPA audit company tomorrow.
Well, just something to consider as you think about the application, if there are any specific requirements or deadlines, maybe that could be included, or shortly thereafter, or once approved, just so then, because I think some of the question was, what am I sort of getting myself into if I apply and accept these funds? And so that was a question that just came up. I think I might know the answer to this based on our retroactive conversation earlier, but we have had a significant number of businesses in Westfield invest in outdoor dining. They did that throughout 2020 and into 2021, but a lot of that was prior to that March deadline. So I assume that they couldn't be reimbursed for those expenses if they had proof that that wasn't there previously or that they spent that money on those things?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And the reason why would be, that outdoor dining piece is gonna be responding to the pandemic, right? So it's not like we can show, a negative economic impact is easy because it's like, here was my rent that was not paid, right? That goes back this far. Those expenses, and again, this is not, the IFR doesn't say this is just the way the IFR talks about this.
Sure.
Is we could, like, the city could help you build out outdoor dining. But I don't know that it contemplates reimbursing for outdoor dining. build
Because
out.
we've had some, I mean, who literally were not
Right.
getting anyone inside that,
Yeah.
you know, could show receipts and things that were like, I purchased this in October of 2020 and December of 2020 to have igloos and heaters and all those sorts of things. So if that's something that could be investigated further, I think it'd just be good to know yes or no for sure, because I
Yes.
think there'd be an opportunity to support several businesses that did kind of step up to that moment. I know there'll be some going forward that certainly are gonna look to continue to do that, but just a question that got asked.
And that's, yeah, we have, through like the National League of Cities and NACO, the National Association of Counties, we have access to sort of databases of what other groups are doing, so it's something that I think we can look at. Are there any other communities that have sort of come to the conclusion that was okay? And I will bathe myself in the IFR again in an attempt to decide, to figure out if the language,
Sure.
because so much of it here is, you almost have to be like a wizard sitting
Yeah, no, I
contemplating your
understand.
crystal ball about what does the Treasury mean when they say. Mike
My-
and I had like a 2.5-hour conversation one time about a sentence.
My next question was, so there are several mentions within the documents that the law provides that talks about first using dedicated grants and programs that are already in existence within the government or county or state or local government. Do you believe in the application that they're going to need to prove that they've applied and been denied those other grants? You know, will that be a part of the application process or not? Just a question that got raised, and so I wanted to ask that.
I think that the IFR definitely contemplates not permitting sort of double coronavirus relief funds. I would have to look specifically in the IFR to determine. I don't know.
Well,
the
it
answer.
said like you had to attempt to apply in some cases first for these other funds. So like Hamilton County, for example, offered funds up at some point. Some people applied, some were declined. So then maybe that would be something that we'd have to share as part of the application process or not. But just a question to raise, so as you're thinking through the application, it's potentially something that.
I was thinking a question similar to that would need to be on our application. Just,
Okay.
I mean, the history of if they've applied for funds and received any in the past.
Great. Can I keep going with a few more? Okay. When considering the, I think it's the section on the providing premium pay to eligibility, or for the eligible folks who were essential workers, obviously we're acknowledging and recognizing the city staff who are our first line responders, that sort of thing. Any consideration to businesses in Westfield like Kroger or Raise Trash or those sorts of things that would be able to have their employees or the company on behalf of their employees apply for some of those funds potentially? And related to that, I guess, and this was something you had addressed, would it be, in that case, issued to them with a 1099? So then they would have to submit that, you know, paperwork with their tax paperwork, as opposed to, in that case, with the city, obviously they're on city payroll and taxes could be withheld. But just wondered if there was any consideration to expand that beyond the city's staff.
There really hasn't, to my knowledge, and I don't speak for everybody on the committee, because, I mean, maybe you've thought about it and not, we haven't brought it up in the committee specifically. It's a tricky thing to do there. You know, we didn't put that much into the premium pay. And a lot of these other places have found other ways to offer incentive pay. And so in many cases, there were pay increases and incentive pay for those employees that needed to keep working, you know, like our folks in the grocery industry and different factories and things. I realize not everybody did. I know my husband's a physician and he did not get any of those things, but I don't think that we've specifically contemplated that. It's kind of a whole big can of worms.
Yeah.
That, and with our, I mean, we do have funds, obviously, but we also have great needs here. So we have to consider all of that right now.
Just to piggyback on what Cindy's saying, you know, what's the greater good of the money? I mean, for the community? I mean, and, you know, I sent an email today. I mean, it's, you know, a lot of those people, like what Cindy's saying, they got money from the government. If you made under a certain amount, you already got money.
Sure.
So, you know, what projects can we do for the greater good of Westfield? And how many people, you know, how can the most people benefit from those dollars? You know, and that's tough, but I mean, and I'm speaking for myself, because I'm a callous, heartless person on occasion, but the truth is, those people already got money.
Sure.
You know, and to help that person out, you know, I would not vote for something like that. I mean, I contemplate not voting for some beyond the first responders, because the majority, I mean, the majority of people in Westfield, how can we help them the most? And it's not by giving somebody who had to do a job anyways $1,500. I know that sounds terrible, but it's just, you know.
Yeah, and I can appreciate those answers fully, and I had heard it twice, so I thought, well, it's worthy of bringing up the question and just mentioning it
Yeah, it's a
on
good
behalf
question.
of who I represent, so.
Yeah.
The last little section I have, I would say is relatively selfish regarding the chamber specifically. We sort of view ourselves as a community partner. We're a nonprofit entity that's been established in Westfield for 40 years now. We think that we have an opportunity to work with the council and the ARPA funds. So if there was a decision at some point that, for example, transferring funds that would then be granted to us to businesses that are looking to do certain things, like we had thought of, specifically mental health education and access for staffs and their families, financial planning and estate planning for their respective staffs, coaching and career development, job training, those sorts of things where we could grant some of those dollars out to companies or hire and offer that to the public as like a public seminar or public opportunity, that we would be willing to take on that responsibility. Additionally, we're in the process of developing a shop local initiative with Westfield and launching a website that will take one-time costs and then obviously maintaining it, which we can handle under our responsibility, but to market that local and regionally to folks living in the area. We're going to launch the Westfield calendar in January, which will then be used as a go-to resource for all citizens to promote the different programs that are involved. So in that calendar, we have the YMCA, Wellbeing Coalition, and 10 other partners that have said they'll put information on there. So trying to educate the public as to where to find those resources or those trainings, if that's something that may qualify. A Visit Westfield initiative with the revenue loss that we have from tourism, given that tourism's a big component of Westfield. Is there an opportunity to work with us to try to find ways to increase tourism information and access to information about visiting Westfield? And then finally, we've had a lot of sort of new businesses or individuals who want to start a new business or saw a need out of the pandemic. Is there a potential to grant funds to those individuals as new business incubators and starting that process? So just mentioning all that as you go through the process and you're looking at, we've certainly had lost revenue too, I should mention that, but as you're looking through those opportunities, we see ourselves as a partner perhaps to offer some of that programming from a health and safety standpoint or from the coaching and training. Not that we would be doing it, but that we can help find the right people to do it and can be good stewards to administer those funds. So just wanted to mention that and see, if that's something to consider. And obviously we can provide more information as we go, but wanted to mention that.
Do those seem like, I mean, just for me, and I know you can't probably weigh in on all of those things right now, are some of those yeses and some of those nos in terms of, or is there a lot of gray?
I would think that it's there are some yeses and there are some nos. Things like mental health programming and career coaching are probably okay. Things that are related to helping the tourism and hospitality industry, probably okay. Like the Shop Local initiative, maybe not, probably not. Small business startups are actually, there's a specific FAQ in the FAQs for them about if you had, somebody who as a result of negative economic impacts, was not able to access, the resources to start up a business or is from a disadvantaged group. And the exacerbating effect of the pandemic has stopped them from, so if you can show sort of those things, then yeah, small business startups are in there. There's a lot of complex concepts in that list, and the IFR it's more gray than black and white. I really we'd have to sit down with a whiteboard, the IFR, and try to sort those.
Yeah, as I thought about the greater good and what we could be doing to impact the business and community as a whole, I think we're in a position to be a good partner there, and would be willing and excited to work with the city to see how we can facilitate that, whether it's we're applying for grants to do the things I've mentioned, or whether there is transfer of funds and we have to be responsible to reporting back. All those things are on the table for us, and we'd be open to having that conversation. So just something to consider.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you guys for your time.
Next on The Price is Right.
Craig Wood, I'm a local resident, born and raised in Westfield. Going to put my 2 cents in. That's why I come to these meetings from time to time, and I'm acquainted with at least most of you. I would like to thank the gentleman for making the explanation about kind of giving us a synopsis of what this is involved in. Initially looking at that paperwork, it looked to me, well, you're going to be trying to divide a piece of pie, and how many pieces can you get out of that pie? And the deeper you got into it, I think it looks more like you've got a Texas sheet cake and you're trying to give a portion to X, Y, Z, and whoever else. I don't blame you. I don't envy you on that situation. But I would like to make an appeal for money for the Westfield Y. Now, why should you consider doing that? I'd like to build that case. Westfield Y is an established 501 nonprofit. Westfield Y is a unique entity in that it has the ability for people who utilize it to develop body, mind, and spirit. Why is that important? Well, we look around the community, we can see the good things, we can see the bad things, we can see where opportunities to help build that body, mind, and spirit would augment some of the other organizations such as Westfield Wellness and some of the other entities around here that are dealing with the upside and downside of life as we know it. I think most of us would relate that during this pandemic, it's been a little unnormal, and there's an additional stress, and you need a relief. And some people go about that in a good way, and some people don't. The Westfield Y, I think, would give an opportunity to help relieve that stress. It's also a way to put some capital money into a facility. why would we need that facility? Well, our family is utilizing the new aquatic center. And we're in the situation because they are sharing it with the schools, which is a great partnership. I really appreciate that. It speaks well for the entire community. However, because of the hours that the school uses and the hours that the public can use it, there's some overlap, and respecting the locker room space for students can have it by themselves, that adults can have it by themselves, but not at the same time. Respect that. Totally understand why. So to begin with, they could maybe develop or add on some additional locker space, but they also need the rest of the building to provide that opportunity for body, mind, and spirit development. So I think that there's a win-win. As I look around Westfield, I step outside my front door. I see Chatham. I see Osborne Trails. As I step outside my back door, I see all the new development on Spring Mill Road. I can see a little bit of the things coming in on State Road 32 on a good day. So this community is growing. There's going to be a lot of people, and they got some needs. And I think the Y is an excellent way to help provide for those needs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. And we've had extensive discussions. I know Scott and I have both been talking about this for a long time. We've had a request from the Y to our city council for extensive donation, if you will. And we are trying to see if we can accomplish some of that with this money. We are facing the difficulty that our guidance does not allow us to use it for new construction. And that is pretty much where it's at right now. And unless the guidance changes, we basically can't.
So, yeah, that has been the challenge for so many communities with priorities like that. And I've heard about the Y Project a lot of times. I'll tell you, the committee has a lot of passion about the Y Project. And I've spent a million hours trying to figure out how to make the Y Project work, or it feels like it. The interim final rule, you can't even build a brand new facility to do a COVID vaccination and contract tracing clinic. Not for really any purpose can you do new construction. There's one sort of exception for that, and that is if you are in a qualified census tract, which is a designation based on income that is provided by the Housing or Urban Development. And nothing in Hamilton County is in a qualified census tract. There's none in Westfield. So you guys sort of don't fit the one exception that might allow new construction. And so new construction is just sort of totally out of the question under the IFR. That being said, we discussed 3011. Senate Bill 3011, which would reclassify up to $10 million or 30%, whichever is higher, of any unit's funding into revenue loss funds. Revenue loss funds could be used on new construction because any government service is within the boundaries for revenue loss funds. So essentially what you would do is you sort of play with the fungibility, and you would use the revenue loss funds to provide government services, and then you would use the money we didn't spend on government services to build the YMCA. So you can do a broad range of right. Once you can move money over into the general fund, we can do a wider array of things with it. That being said, Congress is Congress, and Congress has a very busy dance card, and getting Congress to focus on the things that would be helpful for us in this room right now, difficult. We don't know when they're going to move on it, or if they're going to move on it. But if they do move on it, that would open up this avenue to provide the funding. And the good thing, sort of circling back to our time horizon, is we have until 2024 to encumber the funds and 2026 to spend them. So if it takes a few months.
Maybe the new bills maybe pass by 2024.
Well, we would hope before 2024. Yes, yeah. My sincere hope is like in the next couple months. Otherwise, we sort of run into procedural issues with the Senate. But we have a couple months to wait and see and hope that Congress decides to give that flexibility. And nothing in Washington seems to be bipartisan, but the Senate passed it unanimously. Everybody. Joe Manchin high-fived Ted Cruz, and everybody agreed on it. So hopefully we can get the House on board as well.
And that's one reason why we're kind of crawling right now with the use of this funds, to give us the flexibility, if that does happen, to shift some things that we feel are high impact to the community. And I don't think there's a counselor, I think I can speak pretty confident saying, I think we all want to find a way to help the Y. We may not all agree what that looks like or how much that is, but I think that it's unanimous that the council sees the value of the Y. So we're kind of keeping our powder dry, and let's see how it plays out over the next few months.
Let me ask you this, right now we're sitting in this money special fund, the 176, so you mentioned about we can move to general fund if, did I understand the passes?
If it becomes classified as revenue loss funds, so if under 3011 you could reclassify, you could pretend we had a $10 million loss of revenue that we're going to use these funds for, yes, then it becomes usable for any government service, and we can push it into the general fund. Yeah.
Shannon?
So I just had a question. So, well, first thing, thank you so much for explaining it all. I think that we're learning as we go along, and obviously I'm going to be following Bill 3011. I'll let my college kids know. Like, my mom's got a new passion project, and it's Bill 3011. My question about the existing funds is, if you could provide some clarification. We talked about, so the Y already, we have infrastructure, right? Like, not a full YMCA, but we have that. And what Craig was alluding to is, would it be possible, is it to apply for a grant that would allow us to have additional locker room space to spread, how I think you talked about like distancing and social distancing and things like that. And so for the existing facility that we have, if we were to have an additional locker room, then that would provide social distancing opportunities for all of our active older adults, our current members, and those kind of things. Would the application, would that be applicable in the application with the existing funds?
So insofar as you have an existing facility, that your engineer and architect are willing to sort of certify to that this improvement or renovation or equipment addition to the facility has the benefit of mitigating the impacts of COVID-19 on the use of this facility, then
This
yes.
is just me thinking this, like clearly there's powers higher than me, that's what I was thinking, like that would solve a crisis, if you will, in our existing infrastructure.
Right, yeah, so insofar as your facility doesn't accommodate distancing that would be
Right.
appropriate for the virus,
Correct.
yes. You can make renovations to a facility to provide additional space.
Could you add square footage or just renovate the existing space?
Good question.
Is a good question.
Let's not answer it tonight. Let's just let me remain optimistic.
I agree.
That's another, I'm gonna have to sort of write that down.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to bathe in
I
that.
know.
We've got
We would-
this 10,000 square
No, we
foot
would do the
locker
checks and
room.
balances. It would not be that big of a locker room, but it's a situation that we have in partnership with the schools right now. When the schools are using that, we don't share space, because of the IHSA rules and things like that. So I was just thinking about that.
Right, yeah, and that's, and like, well, and the big cabin on it is that you have to find a professional who is willing to certify, right, to the COVID mitigation element.
There's always-
So our
there's always
architecture
one.
would say, this is our plan. With this funding, we could do this to allow for social distancing in this existing facility.
Right,
If it could be additional square footage, not the whole ball of wax, but that little piece of the pie. And
Right.
that would be something that we could apply for, not that we might not necessarily get, but something that we could apply for in the application process.
right. And I would say that all of the projects that I have dealt with thus far in this space have been like ancient county courthouses with 800 employees pushed into, teeny tiny little rooms with no ventilation and a boiler system that was there when John Adams was president, right? And they need a new HVAC system, and we need an open concept office.
Right.
We've yet to do. We're expanding the facility.
To allow for
To
social
allow it.
distancing.
But that doesn't mean that the IFR maybe wouldn't allow it. Just
Okay.
have to
I like that
submerge
answer.
myself in it again.
All right. Thank you.
So I just have one other question, and I forgot to introduce myself. Sorry. My name is Adeniki McKinday, local resident and business owner. So, and I know that you guys are probably still working this out, but since you kind of let us know right off the bat, listen, small businesses, you may not be getting anything. Will there be another meeting where you break down what you consider to be the greater good in this bucket, so that people can kind of go through and clearly see what your priorities are and make comments on those as it pertains to whether it relates to us or not?
I think that's a great idea.
We definitely will be doing that. We have only had a few meetings since this started, and again, I feel terrible saying it in a way, but we are kind of dragging our feet, waiting to see what this guidance is going to bring. But at the same time, if somebody's kind of suffering out there, obviously, we want to be able to help them sooner rather than later. So it's
Right.
kind of this bit of a quandary we're in. The first key to that is going to be to figure out the application process, and as well as how we will go through and process those, and how much is available, and how we're going to probably be scoring those in terms of what's going to qualify. But I think before we even get there,
Right.
we are going to refine all these buckets as we move along, and that's one of the beauty parts of the way that this template is done that we're using. It does allow us to keep changing it. So basically, every time we further refine it, we'll be able to then have further guidance of what our plan actually is. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Here's a question here for the attorneys, just real quick. A question that was texted to me. It says, can a household or business who received previous funds through the CARES Act be eligible for ARPA funds, essentially double dipping?
The IFR generally doesn't allow for kind of double relief in that way. It's going to ask, the IFR seems to contemplate asking for proof of previous funds. Individuals is going to be different than businesses, most likely. Businesses are there are fewer things you can grant businesses for than you could grant individuals for.
Okay.
And by the way, our next ARPA committee meeting is December 17th in this room at 2 o'clock. And that is, what you mentioned, Admike, is probably something that we will be discussing at that time.
Hello, I'm John Dietz. I'm a local resident, orthopedic surgeon here. I'm not speaking for OrthoIndy. I'm a member of the board of directors of the YMCA. I'm not speaking for the YMCA. I just wanted to say that I appreciate your measured approach, taking a very hard look at it. I appreciate what I think I'm seeing in your proposals is trying to leverage the funds to make meaningful improvements in public health. So, I mean, after all, it is a public health law. And one of our greatest challenges at this moment in time is mental health in this community. And we really need to meet those 25% of people that can't get to get to facilities like Grand Park. They just can't afford it. So I really do appreciate the way that you're approaching it. I just wanted to offer my support. And take note that today is December 7th and Pearl Harbor Day. And that I do believe that our forefathers would look down on this and say, you guys are doing the right thing. Thank you for having a public discourse and trying to take care of these public dollars properly. Appreciate it.
Thanks. I see Cheryl arrived. I think that's you back there. My
You're the only one who
vision's
hasn't
not too good.
spoke, so you really should.
Does anyone have anything else that's popped into their head after hearing what you've heard tonight? And if you don't want to talk tonight, again, you can contact us anytime. I mean, I know at least the three of us counselors here are broadly available, and we will know how to find and track down and really harass our attorney here. or several of them anyway,
It's my full-time job to be available for harassment, so,
and you've been very
so
helpful.
if at any point you need me.
And I figure there will be a lot more questions as we get closer to application processes and how all the compliance is going to work. I figure there's going to be a lot more, probably stakeholder-style meetings so we can help people individually if that needs to happen and things like that. So as we keep treading through this and getting further down the road, we're gonna stay with you and figure out how we best use these funds for the community. Is there anything else? Steve has one more?
I'm going to say one more thing. So the chamber, on behalf of the chamber, I think our public #1 priority project was to see a new library. Now that that is well underway, our public priority 1 project is to see a new YMCA. So I want that, our community wants that, the chamber membership wants that, it is a priority. What I've shared with you today is to offer alternatives if the Senate bill does not come into an existence, and to just, say that we'd like to be a partner in that process. But I wanted to make sure I was on record for everyone that it is an important project, and our business community would like to see that happen. We hear that all the time, so thank you.
Great, thank you, Steve. I have one more thing that pops into my head, and it's just, the mental health issue is so critical for our community, and we are in a very unique position. If you all recall, our Wellbeing Coalition did a survey of our community about mental health. I mean, all of that, the well-being survey. And granted, it wasn't a huge survey, but it was results right before we got shut down. And so, just personally, I would really like to see that redone and figure out how it's really impacted our community, because that will also help drive for their needs, especially those that are related to the pandemic. And sometimes it's hard for us to understand a lot of the people who we need to help most are not the people who are coming to this meeting tonight. I'll just be honest. And so it's really challenging sometimes to figure out how to best help those who need it the most. So I continue to look for ways to do that. So if you have ideas, let me know. And I guess then we'll call it. I really appreciate everybody showing up tonight.
Try to turn this off.
Track me down anytime. Oh, was there another question we didn't answer? Misha, was there a question on there we didn't?
No, I'm just making sure everybody filled up the information.
Oh, thank you.
We can give them information.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.